G'day, I'm Barry Green. Thanks for joining me on Conversations on Western Tourist Radio 87.6 in the coastal towns in the southwest of Western Australia and the Radio WA podcast. My next guest is a former Australian Army officer, a senior engineer, and an author of the book Citizen One Book. And I first came across Paul G. Conlon on Club Grubbery, which is a independent media program run by Graham Hood, former Qantas captain, and John Larter, a former New South Wales paramedic, who lost his job when he didn't participate in the COVID injection trial. So, Paul, I guess we're all part of this new independent media that's sort of evolving around the world. Can you tell our listeners a bit about what brought you to what you're doing now and to writing your book?
Yeah, great question, Barry, and great to be with you. Looking forward to our chat. Look, like many of us, I suppose, about half a decade ago now, I was casually going about my life and had a career and goals and all that stuff. And then in the blink of an eye, it seems the world changed, didn't it? And kind of looked around in disbelief as every institution and assumption that I had about our way of life kind of crumbled in real time. And it wasn't too long before I decided that I wasn't going to sit by and idly let everything that I knew and loved change in such a negative way. And I thought, what could I do about it? So, being an engineer, I took a fairly early interest in some of the enforcement technologies that were being rolled out and discussed, particularly the kind of check-in apps and these sort of digital gateways that were positioning the state between the individual and resources in life. And with my military history, I've got a family history in 1930s Germany. I have somewhat of a historical awareness, particularly around the identification side of things and what can happen when governments learn too much about the people and the people lose sight of what's actually happening with government. There's an asymmetry there. And I guess those two pillars really drew me to research quite deeply what the historical patterns say about what I was seeing unfolding 5 years ago. And it turns out that it's a very well trodden path when the state oversteps its boundaries, I suppose, in terms of what it should know about the people and the decisions it makes. And so I researched quite heavily the kind of 1930s era in Europe and some of the consequences of that, and decided to weave that in with my family history and produce a very human story rather than a textbook. And it was a project of many years, and it's been received very well. I think people have been able to use it to articulate, what they know they feel is off, but can't really put their finger on. So that's the genesis of the book.
I think that's happened for so many of us. And in your book, you talk about, or on your website, paulgconlon.com, you talk about your family history. You had grandparents on both sides of the Second World War. And my father fought in the Second World War. He crossed the English Channel on D-Day +1. So my father possibly shooting at your grandfather. How absurd is all that? And I guess this is playing on tourist radio and tourism, especially now we've got international tourism again. People from all around the world are mixing with each other, and we come to realize we've all got the same interests. We just want to have a healthy life with our family, and I'm coming to see more and more this whole COVID event was the same processes that drive wars, and it's the elites, the 0.01% or less that want everybody else to be subservient. And maybe COVID's had a purpose. Maybe it's the Great Awakening. And the difference between now and previous times is that we do have the internet and the information throughout history. Information has been controlled by kings and queens and bishops and dictators, and more recently Rupert Murdoch. But the internet's changed that, and people can have these conversations and so there's the online side, but then you can still write a book and you can get it sold. And the Light Australian newspaper is a hard copy newspaper, and that's also online and as a PDF and not hidden behind a paywall. So we are really in an exciting period in history, I think, Paul.
I'm with you 100% on that, Barry, and I'm glad to see you kind of start to highlight the positive aspects of this, the silver linings, because yeah, maybe to our failing, a lot of us, and quite understandably, have focused on the negative side. Look what's unraveling before our eyes, and look, I think a society does really need to keep a finger on that pulse. But there's also somewhat of a moral obligation, isn't there, to look at what's positive and what we can build out of this, and with the ultimate goal of gifting something better than we inherited to our own children. And you're absolutely right. Right. At the end of the day, we're all human, and the vast majority of us have the same drives to prosper, you know, procreate, prosper, have some sort of meaningful contribution in our life. And there are many ways that can many shapes that can take. And yeah, that's becoming kind of increasingly difficult, isn't it? And you mentioned war there. Isn't that just one of the endless human tragedies? War is, we were talking before we recorded, just the ultimate failure of politics and diplomacy, isn't it? It's the absolute last resort. It's the arranging to fight the schoolyard bully behind the shed, at lunchtime, and all diplomacy and conversation has failed, except it's done at a national scale with great loss, and we just seem to repeat these same patterns of hate at great scale, and the people that kind of sit behind mahogany desks somewhere and orchestrate these pieces are removed from the humanity of these grand tragedies. And I do feel if we were left maybe to solve problems closer to the ground, there'd be a lot more skin in the game, and there'd be a lot more palatable outcomes and positivity for humanity in general. So yeah, that I definitely see that as a positive going forward. We've got a lot of challenges, but each challenge maybe represents an opportunity to unite where we're otherwise divided.
Think so. And the divide and rule thing that's been in place, and we can rise above it. You talk about it's important to see the silver lining behind the cloud, and it's been hard to see, but there's more and more things happening, and even in America with the Maha movement, Make America Healthy Again. There's the real and that Australians not hearing much about that because really, what that is Robert Kennedy and Trump taking on the big American corporations, specifically the pharmaceutical industry. And my background is as a radio technician, and I was taught to fix a problem, you've got to understand and address the cause. And what's happened in Australia, our mainstream commercial media, and sadly the ABC, uh, you've got to understand the commercial media is paid for by advertising from big food, big ag, not big pharma. They've got the government to do the advertising for them, but all the bigs, and so that the legacy media isn't questioning any of this stuff because that's where their cash flow comes from. And so this is a community radio. I'm also now, but this is actually a private company, Western Tourist Radio, but I'm also involved in community radio, and you know. Community radio is volunteer driven. So we've been able to have conversations that haven't been had in the mainstream media because the people that are paid journalists have to toe the line to keep their job. So, that's not how democracy is supposed to work. The media and journalism is supposed to, hold government to account, but they haven't been doing that for the last 5 years.
Yeah, well, the things you described there are the natural end state of power and dependency, isn't it? The more power is allowed to accumulate in any area of society, you get problems because we're very incentive driven. As a species, humans are. There's that saying, show me the incentives and I'll tell you the behavior and the outcome. We're very predictable in that way, and it's one of the most corruptive drugs available, power, isn't it? And yet we persist on building, our social structures and our institutions on that very corruptive thing. So yes, you get all sorts of distortions that serve the further aggregation of power. And I've had these kind of conversations late at night with myself. How do I guard myself and my family against that addictive drug? That, if power was placed in front of me, I know I'm just human, and it's only a matter of time before I will yield in some way and start justifying my control of others to myself and to others. And we need checks and balances in place, and that's going back to your kind of community radio approach. That is what communities are for. We have peers. If we're lucky enough, we have peers positioned around us that allow us to keep us a little in check when we start to go awry in that regard. and favor ourselves over others. And it's a beautiful self-correcting kind of environment, isn't it? When we operate at a community level, and again, nutrition comes into that. You raise the quality of food and the Maha movement. Yeah, when the further the decisions are made away from where the impacts are felt, the worse the outcomes. And that's what one of the purest forms of that is the example of food. You know, when you can decide what you actually run your body on and put in your mouth, that's why everything else is based on that, isn't it? Food drives the quality of your decisions, the quality of your mood, and the quality of your relationships. So, yeah, that's what I would like to see is decisions placed, closer to the ground, and the rewards, I think, fall naturally out of that.
I think you're right. And you talked about aggregation, and I was a tech in commercial television in Western Australia for 14 years. GWN Television was the only commercial broadcaster in regional Western Australia. But what's happened since of recent times is and broadcast radio, the same thing. They talked of aggregation. So, instead of where you had lots of independent broadcasters, they've all been bought up and owned by a handful of organisations. They've referred to as aggregation. Within the industry, it was generally referred to as aggravation. But the same thing's happening in agriculture. They talk about aggregation of farmland, which is a really, really dangerous path to be going down. Because at the end of the day, food, our health is determined by the nutrition in the soil and the biology in the soil. And this is a really exciting, the whole regenerative agriculture movement's a really exciting place to be in at the moment because the internet's providing a mechanism for the independent scientists to work with innovative farmers and get a better result without the expensive inputs. So it is really this grassroots change that's happening, and the Maha movement and Robert Kennedy, Joel Salatin's part of that. He's a regenerative agriculture farmer in America. And this is getting back to first principles of having lots of small farms, small to medium-sized farms producing quality food, and I guess that's again, this is playing on tourist radio, and very much the tourism experience to people visiting the southwest of Western Australia is the food and the wine. So this comes down to an economics, and we focus as a society on economies of scale. I've been involved in permaculture, and the concept there is stability through diversity, and the two are at odds. But I think the fact that we can have this conversation, we can broadcast it on community tourist radio, we can have it online. This is regenerative media, and this is creating great opportunities because information is no longer controlled by that narrow minority of people. And this is the essence of what your book's about, I guess.
100%. So we're definitely circling around that one core concept of decentralization, aren't we? And you can see the benefits no matter where you apply it, whether it's in the financial space, in the governance space, in the agricultural space. It's obvious, it's self-evident, isn't it? And you can see where the danger, particularly when in food production, where it comes in, is that the more you centralize something, the more you have all the eggs in the one basket, almost literally. One type of problem can bring the entire system to its knees, and that's exactly the category of issue we face with centralized digital ID and identification and all the other kind of centralizations of institutions that otherwise work quite elegantly in a decentralized fashion. And, in the military, they make quite a system out of rotating people around postings, that you'll get postings to different states, different companies. It's quite a deliberate thing. And the benefit of that is you'll often get new people coming in, or not new to the system, but new to the posting, and they'll observe what's happening on the ground, in the company, and they'll say, what, I've seen this problem in my last posting, and this is how we dealt with it. And you get these sharing of innovative ideas, and you take what works given the environment and the locale and the circumstances, and you reject what doesn't, and yeah, you don't have a single point of failure anywhere. And particularly with permaculture, too, there's an elegance to just getting out of the way of these natural systems. And, when you let life unfold the way it's kind of meant to, unsurprisingly, you get really, really good results. So yeah, decentralization, I think, is something we've abandoned over the past decades because we have been tempted by economy of scale, as you mentioned there. You know, it's a there's validity to that. You know, in engineering, you certainly look to reduce costs to try and scale things where appropriate. But when you pursue that almost religiously, it creates all sorts of other systemic problems, and I think the pendulum's swung far too far towards centralization in almost every area of modern life, hasn't it? And perhaps we're observing, you know, that we're living through a fantastic time where we're watching the pendulum perhaps start to swing back, and people remembering what it's like to do things differently, to try things that are different, and to just have different ideas and a diversity of views, and let the ideas speak for themselves and the results, you know, speak for themselves. And I think we'll be healthier and happier as a result.
I think you're right. And this is being recorded just before Christmas in December 2025. And we talk about the silver lining and optimism and pessimism, and I've been prone to black dog disease, and which isn't any fun. But I think I've through it and having come out of it, I think I've developed sort of what you might call a natural immunity to it, and I think just being optimistic makes you feel better, and it feels better to be optimistic, and there is so much to be optimistic about. And one of the things that Dr. John Campbell is a UK medical educator I've been following since early in the COVID con. He's got some great interviews, but more recently he's been talking about people with cancer self-medicating with various out-of-patent drugs and you know curing their cancers. Now that's only a few cases, but the state of Florida in America, it's now the government's spending money to investigate the use of these out-of-patent drugs for code for cancer treatment, and it's becoming increasingly obvious that some of these drugs were quite capable of dealing with COVID anyway. So I guess that I know I believe in private enterprise, free market, but when the free market fails, there's absolutely a place for government involvement. And so if the state of Florida can find ways to treat cancer without a patent drugs, then you know that's a really positive thing. And I think there's growing evidence now that the whole COVID injection really wasn't necessary because lots of us that didn't get it are doing quite well, and the bad mouthing of ivermectin was really just the 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 pharmaceutical industry with just too much control over government. And people have been saying that, you know, big pharma's too big to fail. But of course, they said that about the Titanic. I said it was too big to sink, but it sank. So I think that with the new scientific understanding of the biology of the human guts and the biology in the soil, we really could be on the verge of a new renaissance with the scientific knowledge to understand human health, and that involves more people in agriculture because it has involved physical work and it can't all be mechanized. So it's an exciting time. You've got young kids, I've got grandkids. I think we all do what we do for the love of our kids, and that's the important thing. And I guess another aspect that's becoming more apparent to me is this whole thing about whether it's Christianity or spirituality. And Graham Hood, who was interviewed you, and we've I've interviewed him, he's interviewed me. He comes from a very Christian perspective, but seeing Christianity as different from the church. Do you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah,
Church has become a bit of another commercial bureaucracy in a way.
yeah. So lots to unpack there. Uh, one thing I guess I'll push back a little bit on, perhaps, if I may, is I'm
Absolutely.
very
It's
much
about a free discussion.
yeah, I'm very much, I confess, a government minimalist, and very much because it's just a manifestation of that very dangerous power drug that I mentioned before. I guess for you and me both, the temptation is always to say, once I get the reins of state power, I'll make the right decisions. But you know that's where the depths of communism leads, and you know there's that adage: never grant anyone the political power that you wouldn't give to your worst enemies, because ultimately they'll one day acquire it. So yeah, too much control over government will happen and that pendulum will swing. And I think the only real solution to that is to agree as an act of civility, of human civility, that power structures are to be avoided and that, free markets are much more natural, self-correcting systems where you have voluntary interactions and both parties get to define what a good outcome is for them, and that's something that a centralized system can't achieve at all. So I consider that kind of discussion a one of not one of extent, as in how much power is enough, but one of type, that it's just inappropriate for our species. And once you accept that as a kind of moral foundational principle, then a wealth of opportunities that deliver exactly the kind of outcomes you're talking about flourish and open up. But yeah, once you kind of let that kind of enemy into the gate type thing, and you say, well, this is the right amount of government, then everyone will be debating that, and once they get their reins on it, then of course the first act of acquiring power is to acquire more power at the expense of your political opponent. So I guess some thoughts there, but yeah, going on to your next point there about the church and spirituality, it's a very interesting, it's another interesting component of the times we're living through, isn't it? Because uh, you know, on my personal journey, I've had a troublesome history, shall we say, with organized religion, and there's been various personal reasons for that. But I remember my Oma, my grandmother on the German side, once said to me something that really stuck, and I was just a boy, really. I think I was bad mouthing religion at some point, as you do. You ignorantly know everything as a boy, don't you? And she just looked at me and said, I know people who only survive because of their faith, literally. And I remember thinking that grounded me, it sobered me, and I thought that's got to be worth something. And so started a lifelong journey of uncovering what spirituality could really do and what religion is there for. And look, it's ultimately my view is it's one one possibly of a number of ways that you can derive a moral framework about how you conduct yourself and how you treat others. And certainly, I think Christianity has historically done a very good job of that. I think it's particularly in the last half decade, I must confess, when I've seen what life is like without it. It's very easy to criticize something when times are good, isn't it? But when you see the depths of horror that humanity is capable of diving to, then you're more considered about chipping away at some of the fundamental pillars that have helped, keep society civil. So in that vein, I think you're quite right. I think there's a separation between religious beliefs or even secular beliefs that people can use to derive a moral framework and the institutions that claim to represent them. And, we opened this discussion with me describing my horror as, the institutions and pillars fell around us. And I can honestly say that I think the church can be included in that group, the institution of the church, that is the
And the unions
ease
that were
at
supposed to
which
stand up for
unions
people.
are another one that I think that they're all bundled together, aren't they? Sadly. Yeah, the unions are another good one. Unions and structured religion were two particular ones that I thought this is what this institution was built for, to put the brakes on society and put themselves in harm's way when things start to go off the track, and the lubrication with which compliance seemed to flow out of these institutions was quite alarming to me. One of those things that you only really appreciate when you live through it.
Yep.
And maybe it grounded me more in my grandmother's stories of the 1930s Germany as well. The reality on the ground is that if you show up to a church and you claim to abide by this principle in life, then it is, placed upon you that when times get tough, that your moral framework is of higher value to you than the consequences of upholding that. And unfortunately, I think we saw many examples of the contrary, with churches closing their doors because of safety. Churches should be actually quite inherently unsafe places. That anywhere where you stand up for a moral framework, you are likely to cop arrows. And perhaps that was to our shame a missed opportunity to demonstrate to our kids who are watching us day and night what we do when that inevitable clash appears between your moral view of the world and what those who hold the reins of power tell you to do. And they're decisions we've all had to confront in our lives. And I hope that the what I just described there has given people who go to church and claim to follow certain principles, given them something to perhaps reflect on. To be fair, I also saw the opposite. I did see people who, when tested, passed the test. They weren't all talk. It was, no, this is, I will serve my beliefs and what I believe to be true and moral, despite and even maybe because of what happens to me. That's irrelevant to me. And so that's the positive side. As Solzhenitsyn wrote about, the line that separates good and evil goes through each human heart. And so we definitely saw both of those. But yeah, at the risk of going on too much longer, definitely, it's just another example of institutional collapse and the ultimate end state of aggregated power.
You're right, Paul. We are living through a very interesting period in history, and the time will come when the history will be written. So these conversations will be online for the record. They'll be stored offline for the record as well, and we'll also have a PDF so you can store them as a hard copy. Because the technology is all well and good, but the truth will come out. So thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us today. People who want to get your book, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, so you can get it online at any good book retailer, but I do sell color copies myself at my website, paulgconlon.com, and I've got all sorts of other free resources there. And my mission is really to help people understand a lot of what we've talked about here. The role of responsibility. Freedom requires responsibility,
Absolutely.
especially in the presence of systems designed to remove it. So I help people kind of navigate the modern world at the intersection of kind of family and responsibility and aggregated power. So I think that's the calling of our time, isn't it? So yeah, you can get the book there and lots of other free resources and yeah, enjoyed our conversation, Barry. Thank you very much for your energy and efforts.
Well, thank you. And as Paul said, you can get his book from paulgconlon.com. Thanks for talking to us today, Paul. I've been
Pleasure,
talk
Barry.
I've been talking with Paul G. Conlon on Conversations on Western Tourist Radio as we tell the stories of people and places in Western Australia. To hear this and other conversations, go to touristradio.com.au/conversations.